Good day, everyone. My name is Marie Claire DeLuise. We are the Group 4, and together with my group, we will be going to discuss the process-oriented performance-based assessment. First, let us define assessment and when it is effective. So, when assessment is effective? Assessment is most effective when it reflects an understanding of learning as multidimensional, integrated, and revealed in performance over time. Remember, learning is a complex process. It entails not only what students know, but what they can do with what they know. It involves not only knowledge and abilities, but values, attitudes, and habits of mind that affect both academic success and performance beyond the classroom. Assessment should reflect these understandings by employing a diverse array of methods, including those that call for actual performance, using them over time so as to reveal change, growth, and increasing degrees of integration, such as an approach aims for a more complete and accurate picture of learning. Now, we are going to talk the process-oriented learning competencies. What is process-oriented learning competencies? Process-oriented learning competencies is an information about outcomes is of high importance wherein students end up matters greatly. But to improve outcomes, we need to know about students' experience along the way, about the curricula teaching, and kind of student effort that lead to particular outcomes. Through assessment, it can help us understand which student learns best under what conditions. With such knowledge comes the capacity to improve the whole of their learning. The process-oriented performance-based assessment is concerned with the actual task performance rather than the output or product of the activity. Always bear in mind that assessment is the evaluation or estimation of the nature, quality, or ability of your students. And the process-oriented learning competencies is the learning objectives in process-oriented performance-based assessment and are stated in direct observable behaviors of your students. This is my part in our report. The next part will be discussed by Ms. Vea Buenvenida.
And now, I am going to discuss learning competencies and task design. But first, let's discuss what learning competencies is. When you heard the word learning competencies, what comes into your mind? Keep watching as I will start discussing. The learning objectives in process-oriented performance-based assessments are stated in directly observable behaviors of the students. Competencies are defined as groups or clusters of skills abilities needed for a particular task. The objectives generally focus on those behaviors which exemplify a best practice for the particular task. Such behaviors range from beginner or novice level up to the level of an expert. Here is an example of learning competencies for a process-oriented performance-based assessment. For instance, our task is to recite a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven. And our learning objectives is to enable the students to recite a poem entitled The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, specifically recite the poem from memory without referring to notes. Use appropriate hand-body gestures in delivering the piece. Maintain eye contact with the audience while reciting the poem. Create the ambience of the poem through appropriate rising and falling intonation. And lastly, pronounce the words clearly and with proper diction. Notice that the objective starts with general statement of what is expected of the students from the task, which is to recite a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, and then breaks down to the level of objectives into easily observable behaviors when reciting a poem. The specific objectives identified constitute the learning competencies for this particular task. As in the statement of objectives using Bloom's taxonomy, the specific objectives also range from simple observable process to more complex observable process. Example, creating an ambience of the poem through appropriate rising and falling intonation. A competency is said to be more complex when it consists of two or more skills. Here is an example of two competencies. The following competencies are sample competencies. First is to speak with well-modulated voice. Draw a straight line from one point to another point. Or to color a leaf with green crayon. And another following competencies are more complex competencies. Example, to recite a poem with feeling of using appropriate voice, quality, facial expressions, and hand gestures. Construct an equilateral triangle given three non-collinear points. And draw and color a leaf with green crayon. Learning tasks need to be carefully planned. In particular, the teacher must ensure that the particular learning process to be observed contributes to the overall understanding of the subject or course. Some generally accepted standards for designing a task include identifying an activity that would highlight the competencies to be evaluated. Example, reciting a poem, writing an essay, manipulating the microscope, or etc. Identify an activity that would entail more or less the same sets of competencies. If an activity would result in too many possible competencies, then the teacher would have difficulty assessing the students' competencies on the task. And finding a task that would be interesting and enjoyable for the students. For instance, the topic is on understanding biology diversity. So the possible task design is to bring the students to a pond or creek. Ask them to find all living organisms you can find living near the pond or creek. And also, bring them to the school's playground to find as many living organisms they can. Observe how the students will develop a system for finding such organisms, classifying the organisms, and concluding the difference in biological diversity of the two sides.
So this time, we are going to talk about scoring rubrics. So, do you have any idea about what scoring rubric is? Or do you know what is the purpose why we are using scoring rubrics? So this time, I am going to tell you what scoring rubrics is about. So a rubric is a scoring scale used to assess student performance along a task-specific set of criteria. Authentic assessment typically are criterion reference measures, that is, a student aptitude on a task is determined by matching the student's performance against a set of criteria to determine the degree to which the student's performance meets the criteria for the task. Generally, the purpose of assessment is to serve as a scoring guide that assesses and articulates specific components and expectations for an assignment or a task. So here is an example of a scoring rubric. As in the given example, a rubric comprised of two components, a criteria and a level of performance. Each rubric has at least two criteria and at least two levels of performance. The criteria is the characteristics of good performance on a task. For each criterion, the evaluator applying the rubric can determine to what degree the student has met the criterion. Finally, the illustrated rubric contains a mechanism for assigning score to each project. The rubric includes another common but not unnecessary components, and that is what we call the descriptors. What do we mean by descriptors? So, A descriptors spell out what is expected of students at each level of performance for each criterion. It tells students more precisely what performance looks like at each level and how their work may be distinguished from the work of others for each criterion. Similarly, the descriptors help the teacher more precisely and consistently distinguish between students' work.
Why include level of performance? First, clearer expectations. It is very useful for students and the teacher if the criteria are identified and communicated prior to completion of the task. Students know what is expected of them and teachers know what to look for in student performance. Similarly, students better understand what good or bad performance on a task looks like if the level of performance are identified, particularly if the descriptors for each level are included. Second, more consistent and objectively assessment. In addition to better communicating teacher expectation, levels of performance permit the teacher to more consistently and objectively distinguish between good and bad performance or evaluating student work. Number 3, better feedback. Furthermore, identifying specific levels of student performance allows the teacher to provide more detailed feedback to students. The teacher and the students can more clearly recognize areas that need improvement. So, analytic versus holistic rubric. For a particular task, you assign students, do you want to be able to assess how well the students perform in each criterion, or do you want to get more global picture of the students' performance on the entire task? The answer to that question is likely to determine the type of rubric you want to choose or to create or to use, analytic or holistic rubric. Analytic rubric. Most rubrics, like the recitation rubric mentioned, are analytic rubrics. An example rubric articulates a level of performance for each criterion. So the teacher can assess student performance on each criterion using the recitation rubric. A teacher could assess whether a student has done poor, good, or excellent job of creating ambience and distinguish that from how well the student did on voice inflection. Holistic rubric. In contrast, a holistic rubric does not list separate levels of performance for each criterion. Instead, a holistic rubric assigns a level of performance by assessing performance across multiple criteria as a whole. For example, the analytic research rubric above can be turned into a holistic rubric. Excellent speaker, good speaker, and poor speaker. Example in the excellent speaker included 10 to 12 changes in hand gestures, no apparent inappropriate facial expressions, utilized proper voice inflection, can create proper ambience for the poem. 2. Good speaker included 5 to 9 changes in hand gestures, few inappropriate facial expressions, had some inappropriate voice inflection changes, almost creating proper ambience. Poor speaker included 1 to 4 changes in hand gestures, lots of inappropriate facial expressions, used monotone voice, and did not create proper ambience. When to choose analytic rubric? Analytic rubrics are more common because teachers typically want to assess each criterion separately, particularly for assignments that involves a larger number of criteria. It becomes more and more difficult to assign a level of performance in a holistic rubric as the number of criteria increases. As a student, performance increasingly varies across criteria. It becomes more difficult to assign an appropriate holistic category to the performance. Additionally, an analytic rubric better handles weighing of criteria.
Lastly, I will be discussing on when to choose a holistic rubric. Holistic rubrics tend to be used when a quick or gross judgments need to be made. It's also best to use when there is no single correct answer or response and the focus is on overall quality, proficiency, or understanding of a specific content or skills. So how many levels of performance should I include in my rubric? There is no specific number of levels a rubric should or should not possess. It will vary depending on the task and journey. A rubric can have as few or 2 levels of performance or as many as you decide as appropriate.